Okay, I hope we all feel welcomed. We have a plenary discussion. We invited distinguished alums of our program, and we didn't give them any instruction. The titles we asked for was HSS Past, Present, Future. They could say anything they want. Steve Shapin joined Harvard in 2004 after previous appointments as professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego, and at the Science Studies Unit, Edinburgh University. His books include Leviathan and the Air Pump, Hobbes, Boyle, and the Experimental Life with Simon Schaffer, A Social History of Truth, Civility and Science in 17th Century England, The Scientific Revolution, now translated into 16 languages, and The Scientific Life, A Moral History of a Late Modern Vocation. He has received many awards and honors, including the Sarton Prize of the History of Science Society and the J.D. Bernal Prize of the Society for Social Studies of Science. He writes regularly for the London Review of Books and has written for The New Yorker. Stephen.
Well, Susan gave us free rein to do what we wanted, so now for something, as Monty Python said, completely different. I know this talk isn't supposed to have a title, but I'm going to give it one anyway. It is Science Has Its Present, Past, and Future. Oh, it's taken. Well, this is the sequel. Thackeray's provocation in 1970 claimed that the way the historical record was treated didn't have a future, and it shouldn't have a future. The way that the history of science then understood its subject was unjustifiable, and it had to be radically reformed if the history of science was itself to have a future as a going academic business. 50 years ago, Thackeray's charge was that the history of science looked like a form of antiquarianism. It was out of temper, he said, with the times. Judging by the major journals, he said the atom had not yet been split, and neither molecular biology nor biochemistry existed. There was no such thing as secret science. There were no interesting connections between science and the military, and industrial science was beyond the pale. What was needed, he said, was the sociology of knowledge, which Thackeray understood as connecting the reception of ideas with the institutional context. Now, Thackeray was prescient, and at Penn, he did a lot to bring that future into being. The ex-scientist departed the scene. The word philosophy vanished to be replaced by sociology, this signifying less the presence of formally sociological offerings than the encouragement of social and institutional history. I left Penn in late 1971, having taken courses in the history of ideas in physics with the wonderful Russ McCormick, the history of biological ideas with the late Charles Culotta, and the history of early modern chemical ideas with Thackeray himself, who was then shifting his interest to the social history of science and industrializing Britain. Some years later, when I was a visitor in the department, the several centers of gravity, as it seemed to me, were a Thackeray-led, quantitatively flavored, and institutionally oriented project on modern American chemistry. The great Tom Hughes, working on modern electrical systems, which admittedly he then thought got no respect. And Rob Kohler, who was then moving from a history of biochemical ideas to a history of institutions. By the early 80s, America had been discovered. Biomedicine existed. There were such things as technological systems, and there were all sorts of institutions. Roll history on a half century, and there are other centers of the history of science that look like Thackeray's dream come true, or parts of it, or even more of it. Take the history of science at Harvard. There are 6 departmental colloquia scheduled for the present semester. Not one deals with any material prior to 1950. There are 14 undergraduate courses currently offered by departmental members. Of these, perhaps 1 or 2 treat any substantial material before the 20th century. 5 take on modern medicine, including global health and COVID. 2 deal with climate change. 2 with technology and modern warfare. And 1 is about podcasting. No course defines itself through a discipline, say the history of physics or the history of chemistry, nor are there courses that offer a history of a particular period, say science in the Middle Ages or science in the Enlightenment, nor of a particular country, say science in France. History of science in the current Harvard teaching mode is a collection of topics about vaccines, epidemics, the Anthropocene, and climate change, about animals, natural history museums, global health, diagnostic technologies, and so on. Among current professors in the department, one is an early modernist, and one is a distinguished Darwin scholar. Antiquity is taken care of by an excellent scholar whose appointment is in the classics department. The pre-20th century past of the East is handled by a distinguished expert in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilization. The current interests of all the rest are firmly rooted in the history of the last century, with many writing the history of the present. Our majors, in Harvard terms of art, concentrators, write an extensive senior thesis. In the current year, of these 31 theses, only 2 dealt with pre-20th century material, and none with any period before the 19th century. The remaining 29 did not deal with disciplines, but with recognized contemporary issues. The making of queer families, the practice of martial arts by modern athletes, attitudes to homosexuality in the American space program, and that pattern is long established. Concentrators can declare an interest in historical topics, but they need not do so, and they rarely do. Apart from a fraction of the required introductory survey designed by Professor Shapin, it's not uncommon for our honors graduates never to encounter any historical material traditionally called as such. Penn's department is not quite that up to date, and Princeton's program looks antediluvian compared to Harvard. But you don't need a weatherman to tell which way the wind's blowing, and has been blowing for some time. This, you should understand, is not a bitter nostalgic complaint from some left-behind old fogey. I am old, and perhaps I should be left behind, but I've written a book about modern American entrepreneurial science. I have never supervised a dissertation on a period before the 20th century, nor have I ever taught a course on the scientific revolution or any aspect of early modern science. The way things are now is not, in my view, a bad thing. How could it be a bad thing to help clever students get to grips with big things that they care about? What is odd, rather than bad, is the mismatch between the stuff many of the professors still write about and the topics they come to teach and supervise. We insist on historical sensibilities about the past, but we don't seem very interested in applying historical sensibilities to ourselves and our subject. Now, our task here is to say something about the discipline and maybe the department over the past 15 years, and this is one way of talking about change. Thackeray's 1970 essay prominently quoted E.H. Carr. Before you study the history, study the historian. Before you study the historian, study his historical and social environment, where the regrettable male pronoun itself belongs to history. So what was happening in the culture surrounding science around the time of Thackeray's essay? The institutional circumstances affecting science had been changing for a long time, though Thackeray was quite right in pointing out that historians of science were writing as if these were of no interest to them. By the mid-20th century, many people who were not historians of science understood what was there to be understood. Science had been well folded into the institutions of production, profit, and power. Even as writers like Popper and Merton worked to bound, celebrate, and sacralize secular science, powerful forces were working to normalize it, to make it a highly valued but routine aspect of civil society. Before 1970, there were intellectual currents that responded to this normalization. Thomas Kuhn's 1962 Structure of Scientific Revolutions stands as evidence. Utterly unconcerned with either celebration, and the thought of denigration never occurred to him, Kuhn nevertheless threw the most enormous spanner in the works. Published as a fascicule of an encyclopedia of unified science, Structure blandly announced that science was, he said, a ramshackle structure with little coherence among its various parts. So much for unity. It said that we may have to give up the notion that science gets us closer to the truth. On reason, Structure said, there was no rational standard higher than whatever the community agreed. And it announced that accepting this picture of science may make, he said, the phrases scientific progress and scientific objectivity come to seem redundant. For all the fuss that book kicked up, it's far better to see Structure more as evidence of sweeping cultural change than as its cause. Published in the same year, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring exposed the harm done to the planet by technologies which the public had increasingly learned to identify with the idea of science. And the year before Eisenhower's farewell address included not only a warning about the military-industrial complex, which we all know, but a less remembered criticism of scientific research done on state command. Thackeray's 1970 essay made waves, but it was also riding on the crest of a wave. He predicted the future, but it was a future that he had the wit to see coming. History of science was on its way to becoming more up-to-date, and in its up-to-dateness it has flourished. Thackeray thought that the history of science should fully belong to history, as George Sarton believed it could never do. And this has sort of happened. While many of our colleagues in the history department still think of science as an abnormal historical topic, after all its products are timeless and escape history, there are more historians of science employed there than there were before. We can publish in history journals, as we never did before. We give papers at historians' conferences, the more so as we address topics of current mutual concern: climate, the environment, food, the body, sexuality, race, gender, colonialism, the practices of government. Getting a place for the history of science at the real historians' table was an intellectual good, but might prove to be an institutional bad. Undergraduate enrollment in history courses is falling off a cliff, just like almost all traditional areas in the arts and humanities. And while the kids are encouraged towards STEM subjects, it's really business studies that has burgeoned. The future of academic history doesn't look good, and it might not be good for its fellow travelers. And another thing that Thackeray didn't see coming: SDS, or science studies. Though fair enough, since the thing scarcely existed at the time of his essay, and even though one of his first PhD students wound up getting a job in the field. In the 1970s and 80s, as STS got going, historians of science were significant presences, going to the 4S Society meetings, publishing in the STS journals, even getting appointments in STS-type departments, both in the States and especially abroad. STS flourishes too, perhaps even more than the history of science. Yet the signs are that these two once aligned disciplines may be going their separate ways. While this much advertised new thing called the history of knowledge offers a home for scholars wanting to apply science studies sensibilities to other intellectual practices. The participation of historians in STS things has radically declined, and distinguished historians like Rainey Daston insist that STS and the history of science never belonged together, and it was a mistake to think that they did. Hitching the history of science wagon to the history department now seems, in business terms, a problematic move. But alliance with STS seems sounder. STS defined as modern, politically engaged, and morally aware. The Harvard undergrads have already, as they say, voted with their feet. Practically all of their senior theses seem to fit more comfortably under an STS umbrella than in the history of science. Then there are the range of topics now commonly written about and taught in the history of science. Thackeray's commendation of up-to-dateness has been fulfilled, but much of what is now taught at Harvard and published in ISIS went unmentioned in the 1970 manifesto. Take, for example, the non-Western world. Nate Sivin was not a member of the Penn Department in 1970, But George Sarton had long insisted that scientific discoveries were not a monopoly of the West, and that Europe owed much to Islam and the East, even if at Princeton Charles Gillespie insisted otherwise, worrying what fate would befall the world when he said men of other traditions, men in China and India and Egypt, not sharing our history and values, appropriate our science and technology. Nor did Thackeray foresee a discipline so much concerned with race and ethnicity, nor did he look into the crystal ball and see women losing their invisibility as historical subjects and feminism emerging as a method. No shame in any of those misdiagnoses. As Yogi Berra famously said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. The centrifugal forces of history have disturbed science's present past. We once talked matter-of-factly about the essence of science, about the unique and coherent scientific method, the special norms of science, and now many of us no longer do, and some of us argue against the stable existence of any such things. Once the scientific revolution made the modern world and was at the center of our concerns, and now advanced thinkers say there was no such thing, or we say that we've never been modern, or that we are modern, and that's a bad thing. Once our discipline had no place or only a marginal place for the human sciences, for applied or industrial science, for vernacular or folk science. Once we understood the history of science to be the history of concepts, discoveries, or disembodied ideas. And now we write fluently about institutions, literary forms, and above all, of work practices. Once scientific practitioners were written about as if they had no bodies, no support personnel, no domestic life, and no material settings of any consequence. Once we took the history of science as a history of consensus, agreement to truth revealed, and now we orientate to conflicts, controversies, and struggles for credibility. And once we accepted that historians were obliged to make a choice between internalism, treating science as an autonomous collection of ideas, and externalism, treating science as influenced by social factors. When was the last time that language appeared in ISIS? So there's no doubt that the history of science over the past half century is a success story, and that much, not all, about the success looks like the realization of Thackeray's vision. The range of stuff that we write and teach about is immensely greater than it was in 1970. The past that Thackeray then complained about is not its present past. Some years ago, the historian Peter Deere wrote a think piece in ISIS asking what the history of science was the history of. Perceptively noting, he said, that the history of science as a scholarly speciality is less obviously self-defining than it once was. And that was a massive understatement. Envisaging a bright future for a professionalized discipline, another thing that Thackeray did not foresee was a discipline whose upward curve of institutional success would meet a downward curve of confidence in its identity, of its ability to say what its subject matter really is. Over the past 50 years, the history of science has been normalized. It has no essence, and we're not too sure of its boundaries. What is science and what is not? We're not snobs anymore, and we follow science. We call it technical expertise, wherever we find it. And that's a mark of the discipline's success. But maybe there's bad contained in this good. In the discipline's past, our ancestors were confident that they knew what science was, what made it special, unique, and worthy of praise. Living in our present past, we're not sure what science is and what, if anything, makes it distinctive. Intellectually, this normalization is a good thing. Institutionally, it may be storing up disciplinary problems of boundary maintenance, of social and quality control. We shall see. And so the question again, science, does its present past have a future? The lessons drawn from the last half century are pretty clear. No, it does not. No present past is immune to the vicissitudes of historical change, and our best guess about the disciplinary future is that it will be different, and all our efforts to be up to date will wind up looking out of date. Thank you.
I'm happy to introduce our third plenary speaker, and that's Professor Keith Wailoo. Keith is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. His books include Pushing Cool, Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of the Menthol Cigarette, Pain, A Political History, How Cancer Crossed the Color Line, and Dying in the City of the Blues, Sickle Cell Anemia and the Politics of Race and Health. He's published many critically important studies on DNA, race, vulnerability, and medical citizenship, as well as publishing in The Lancet, The New York Times, The New England Journal of Medicine, and The Daily Beast. He is the recipient of many awards and prizes, including the Dan David Prize, and he's a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Keith, where are you?
I'm right here. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see everyone, to be part of this wonderful celebration of a half-century plus two of history and sociology of science, and to offer what I will label as light-hearted personal and academic reflections on this vibrant program. I'm tempted to spend all of my time name-checking. I won't do that. But I can vouch for the fact that Gabrielle and Nina were like together all the time. And I'm just so pleased to be here. And I'll try to keep things light because, but to say that this event transported me back 35 years to the fall of 1987 when I arrived on this campus and entered the program. So it was a program that was well into its teenage years. It was about 15 years old, maybe showing all of the problems that come along with those early teenage years. We can get into that later. My path into HSS tells something about what the department had become at that juncture, why people like me found it a great fit. I had been a chemical engineering major at Yale. I'd spent a couple of years science writing, and I was looking for a place to develop a career as a writer about science, medicine, technology, and society. I was coming out of a fascination with C.P. Snow and the Two Cultures, Lewis Thomas, The Lies of a Cell, thinking about writing about science and medicine and society for a broader audience. Historical perspective was one of the things that I was interested in, but it wasn't the only thing. I hadn't even come across the history of science as an undergraduate, and so I'm not sure exactly what alerted me to its existence as a field. But 2 years out from my bachelor's degree, I was living in New Haven, and I asked a professor I'd never taken a class with at Yale, a guy named Larry Holmes, Frederick Holmes, the historian of chemistry who wrote Lavoisier and the Chemistry of Life, if he would have a meeting with me. And in that meeting, I asked him two things. What books should I read if I was interested in this? And where should I apply, given my background and my interests? To give you a sense of his view of the state of the field at the time, he said that I should read books like The Cholera Years, that I should read texts in the history of technology. He named a book or a set of articles by one of his colleagues, Ida Krenakis. And he also mentioned, because I expressed an interest in this, Kenneth Manning's biography of the black biologist Ernest Everett Just, as well as 6 other books that I should read, and I actually went through all of them. He also gave me a lay of the landscape of the different graduate options that might exist. Now, years later, I should say, when I ran into him at a conference and I thanked him for his advice, he had no recollection of ever meeting with me. MIT didn't exist as a program as such. There was, of course, Harvard. In any event, he told me about many of the programs, and he singled out Penn as a particularly amenable place to, well, somebody like me or of my interest. I wasn't quite sure what he meant at the time. I remember sending letters of inquiry to other programs, like to Princeton, which is where I now teach. And so there's this humorous and ironic story. I sent a letter to the person who was running History of Science there, Jerry Geeson, who had just recently published a book called Michael Foster and the Cambridge School of Physiology. You get the sense here, the biographical theme, really heavy. And I suppose it says something about Professor Geeson, who I actually never knew personally, that he wrote back to me at all. What I remember, and I wish I'd kept this, is the letter was a little snippy, and he explained that Princeton was a place for the serious study of the history of science. And he more or less implied that I should really consider other options. So I applied to Penn, and lo and behold, I got in. So that must say something already. So the fact that I got into the History and Sociology of Science program, I think says a lot about the faculty, their openness, and I was amazed to find graduate students that were kind of cut from similar cloth, or people who were looking at the history and sociology of science as a place to sharpen their thinking as they pursued different career paths already in 1987. We were, I think, one of the largest classes in HSS. I think there were 10 of us in that class. I think there were maybe 9 the year before, a really formidable group of people. And from so many different backgrounds, having done master's degrees in the UK, museum work, physics as a background, interested in medical careers, married to the history of medicine, technology, environmental health. Lynn Snyder, is Lynn here? There's Lynn, right? The Denora Smog dissertation. I did 1 name check there. I've done 3 so far. History of diabetes, Chris Feutner. A place where students could build connections across science, medicine, and technology, but also to push into new directions. It became a home, but also a kind of vibrant nexus for students who would go off and do a field in anthropology. Others would head off into communications, social, political history. I mean, one of the most interesting courses I took were in European social history, but also labor history, where I began to think about the connections between point of production studies and the production of knowledge, to kind of marry these analytics that you find really across the academy in service of doing better history of medicine in my case. So some of the most memorable aspects of my time here from 87 till about 92 are because of friendships and professional connections, but some are memorable because of the intellectual scaffolding for the work that would follow, work that I still do, which I really see as beginning here, which is why I titled this talk More on This. Because it reflects something about the skills that you acquire in graduate school, the frameworks for analysis, and a couple of these people know why I'm also saying this. They know where I'm heading, right? The skills, the frameworks for analyzing the past and the present, applied in other contexts, perhaps, approaches to asking critical questions. I mean, those Monday seminars were the best place for understanding how you ask critical questions, even politely framed, that could also be withering in their effect. A few anecdotes. So some of the hot tensions of 1987, many of us will remember the grand debate between internalism and externalism. And that is to say, whether we should spend our time thinking about the internal logic of scientific ideas, technologies, and their creation, practices, or whether we should the sort of think Larry Holmes, Jerry Geeson approach to knowledge, whether we should be thinking about the building of schools, which many of us were interested in, or focus on the social, political, economic, cultural context itself, or whether to think about the dynamic relationship between these. Of course, it's a stark binary, the internalism versus externalism, but it kept us going for quite a while. It seemed really vital and urgent at the time, and in some ways, it still is, in some ways, a useful rubric, a useful tension, a great way of understanding knowledge and how it's organized in the academy and society. And indeed, the organization of knowledge as a motif, as a metaphor, as an analytic, also provided, I think, proved to be continually relevant in the work that we did. So history and sociology of science was the place where we mastered this new language for navigating, transcending, or playing artfully across these apparent divides. So as much as the rigid internal-external tension, internalism-externalism debate seemed rigid itself and receded into the past, I would say it provided a useful scaffolding, habits of mind for critical thinking. It helped to cultivate a productive engagement with crucial ways of thinking about science, medicine, and technology. We also picked up critical ways of thinking about discipline, specialization, laboratory and field science. That was a big shift that was going on in our time in graduate school. The ecology of knowledge, ethnographic sensibilities married to sociology and the history of science. At that time, Arjuna Padarai was here in anthropology, and students were fascinated by his book and his approach to studying the social life of things. Political economy and moral economy, another key point of tension shaping the kinds of questions we were asking about science and medicine and technology. I remember a particularly important session with the faculty. And this is something that many of us, as we were moving through the dissertation writing stage, asked the faculty for a meeting for each of them to offer practical advice on how they finished their first book. I don't know if anybody remembers this session, or maybe it's just sort of stuck in my head. And everyone obliged, showed up. And what I learned from this is, the first thing I learned is that their stories could not be any different from one another. I remember Charles Rosenberg, in his sort of typically abstract, seemingly evasive style, never answered the question, but offered lots of anecdotes. For instance, he described a dissertation in a book as the enterprise of large data management. And then he also explained that you should always be strategic about your projects. I remember him saying, if you ever had the choice between writing a book or an article about 5 years of family correspondence or 5 weeks, go for the 5 weeks. It's just a much more manageable data set around which you could say a great deal, and rather than getting sucked up into the morass of information. I remember Tom Hughes had a very different approach to how he finished his first book. Now, I may be misremembering this, but I think what he said was, he had a list of the 50 most urgent and important questions in the history of technology that he felt needed to be answered. And he wanted to make sure that his book would address all of them. And then I remember Nathan Sivan, or it might have been Rob Kohler, I'm not sure who said this, said very, straightforwardly, we should all aspire to be Weber. That was the answer. Maybe it wasn't Rob. I see Rob shaking his head. So just for the sake of comparison, I remember years later, I asked, when I was trying to finish my first book, I gave a talk up at Yale, and I ran into Larry Holmes again. And I said to Larry Holmes, so, I'm having trouble with the conclusion of the book. How do you know when you're really done? And he said to me very flatly, I write biographies. And when my character is dead, my book is done. And I thought, well, that's one way to do it, right? Just to study in contrasts. So a story about finishing, and then I'll wrap up. So in my own attempts to understand the dissertation as a form, as well as to navigate this internalism, externalism, history of ideas, and social context question, I remember looking to my peers and my predecessors and learning an enormous amount from my colleagues. Something that I think the HSS program is particularly strong at. An abundance of students who are always looking to others for help and assistance and insight. So I remember one day I came to Van Pelt, because this is pre-internet, to look up the dissertation of, I think, the first graduate, Steve Shapin, 1971. And it was a work, I'm going to call out Steve here, right? It's a work that put the early social and institutional history of the Royal Society of Edinburgh against the local social and cultural context. It's a work of collective biography. I guess we would have said prosopography back then, although he never uses the word. I was particularly captivated, not just by reading it, but by the last paragraph, which I still reference to graduate students today, because it's a very craftily written last paragraph. I won't read you the whole thing, because it's largely a social history, an institutional history of the creation of this Royal Society. And it ends by saying, by gaining an entree into the social structure of science and the kinds of cultural activities with which its cultivation was associated, we have begun to address problems which may be broadly classified under the sociology of knowledge. Obviously, I have not attempted to deal with the relationship between the content of scientific ideas and the social structure from which they spring. It should not be impossible to move from this sort of understanding to the more basic problems of the sociology of scientific knowledge. And I remember reading this thinking, this guy is brilliant. He said, here's what I'm doing next. But my dissertation covers, it's a bounded, bracketed closure that tells you a little bit about where the discipline was at the time and where it might head. So I learned a lot from thinking about things like sociology of knowledge, disease, and what is it. I think Charles's, the course I took in my second year, in which he taught a seminar on disease, ended up being incredibly productive for many of us, right? Jeff Brosco, Chris Feutner, myself, Sarah, Tracy. I mean, it just incredibly productive, intellectually engaging. There's some things, as others have pointed out, that really were not well developed and took time to. For instance, the study of therapeutics was underdeveloped. The study of drugs have become a much more vibrant field than it has been at the time, largely driven by external events. Speaking of kind of internal externalism, events like the discovery and wide consumption of Adderall, Viagra, OxyContin, drugs that did not exist at the time, that became part of the, you might say, broader cultural conversation about medicine, drugs, and society. Race. The only predecessor I could think of who devoted any time to thinking about this was Vanessa Gamble, a student of Rosemary Stevens, who laid the groundwork for another generation. I would like to call myself as part of that, developing an understanding of race, the Black experience, medicine, and health. The last thing I'll say is that it only was after I finished at this program and I was teaching at UNC Chapel Hill in the medical school that I came to understand the full array of concrete and valuable skills that I had picked up while in graduate school. And this was driven home to me one day when I was asked to give grand rounds in pediatrics in my new home institution and to talk about a project I was working on, which is a comparative history of Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, and sickle cell disease, and just to trace out how genetic medicine has and has not served patients with these disorders. And so I gave what I consider to be a fairly formulaic three-part history to show how issues of ethnicity, race intersected with issues of innovation in different ways for different populations. And when I was done, engaging conversations. And the chair of pediatrics came up to me and she said, "That was really great. Where did you learn to do that?" And I said, "Where did I learn to do what?" And she said, "Well, everything you said, I recognize, and it's part of our understanding, but where did you learn to put it together like that?" And I raised myself up and I said, "Why, in graduate school, in the history and sociology of science," right? And I kind of grew to own it as like, these are real skills that I have acquired that are transportable and useful in other venues. So I titled this talk "More on This." And I mean it as a metaphor, right? That is to say, to highlight that in the following years, there would be a proliferation of similar kinds of works, all built really using the scaffolding that I've described. And we need also to see more of this going on into the second half century. The other reason I used the phrase "more on this" is I think I've already said this, but the HSS program offered and still offers this framework, a set of skills, ways of questioning topics such as disease, drugs, and therapeutics that I think is incredibly vital, not just in the academic study of history and sociology and anthropology and communications, but also in the broader world of medicine and in social policy, which is where I've also spent most of my career. But I also call it "more on this" for another reason, because there's another dissertation that I would call forth that you should not read, and that is my own. And the reason is that I wrote it while I was at Chapel Hill, and I'm very proud of, bringing it to fruition and driving up here and delivering it to Charles Rosenberg and driving over to Rob Kohler's house and having him sign it. And I was on campus to give a talk a little while later, and I saw the dissertation on the shelf. And so I pulled it down and I opened it up to the abstract, and I knew I'd written it the night before. And it read pretty nicely. And then I opened to a random page and I read another paragraph, and it was pretty good. And I read another paragraph, and it was delightful to read. It seemed really artfully done, and I thought, I was feeling good about myself. And the end of the paragraph, there's a bracket, and it says, "More on this." So that's my version of Steve Shapin's last paragraph. So I end with that to say that, errors and all, the HSS experience, was wonderfully generative, providing a kind of lasting scaffolding, even the glaring missteps like that, shocking and as embarrassing as it is in retrospect. The years here were a memorable, if I could use the word, bracketing of one's intellectual development. It's a short stretch of time, but it was filled with possibility, as if to say that more on this is something that needs to be filled in. It was a promise to myself. It was embarrassing. I closed up the dissertation, put it on the shelf, and I said, "A dissertation is a work in progress." So I'm thrilled to be here from Princeton to really offer what I consider to be very serious observations about the past of the field and the future of the field. Actually, I'm more inclined to sort of think that what I've tried to do is to bring a little bit, or maybe a lot, of the Penn ethos into the program at Princeton. Whether it's successful or not, I will have to decide. Anyway, thanks again.